Hello, everyone, and welcome to Behind the Stigma, a podcast where we bridge the gap between psychology, philosophy, and mental health for everyone. I'm your host, Yara Manova, a PhD student in the philosophy of psychiatry, and our mission is to help you better understand yourself and the world around you. In this week's episode, we are discussing colonization and mental health. Our guest speaker today, who I'm delighted to introduce, is Dr. Summer Fakhro. Dr. Fakhro is a clinical psychologist from Bahrain, currently working at the Lighthouse Arabia in Dubai. She had completed her master's and her doctoral training in clinical psychology in University College London in the UK. She has over 10 years of clinical experience working with people of all ages and a particular expertise in understanding primary attachment relationships, parent-child, and broader family dynamics. In 2021, she moved back to the Middle East in order to serve a region that she cares deeply about. Since her move back, she has begun to explore more deeply the nuances of living or growing up in the region and the psychological consequences of such. She has found that often the Western psychological frameworks may not capture the full lived experience of our clients or support them the way they need. On her personal journey, she has found herself expanding beyond Western psychology for answers, integrating alternative, somatic, and ancient practices such as yoga and spirituality. Currently, she is focusing on better contextualizing her psychological practice to the history and culture of the region and supporting clients through the current context of regional instability and trauma. Well, I'm delighted and truly honored to speak with her today. Dr. Fakhro, Summer, welcome. It's truly a pleasure to have you and to speak with you today.
Thank you, Ciara. I know we've had a long build up to get to this moment, but I'm really, really happy to be here, and it feels more important than ever to be having this conversation.
Thank you so much, Summer. I guess before we dive into this topic of conversation, I'd be curious to ask you if perhaps there's anything you'd like to add about yourself that I didn't mention in my intro that you think is relevant and important to the context of our conversation.
Sure, yeah. So I think part of being a psychologist, it's a really interesting experience in the sense that oftentimes what shapes our practice is our own personal experiences. And of course, we're so heavily influenced by it. And through working through that, oftentimes we get clearer answers about what we want to focus on and where we want to be, and things start to crystallize through our own journeys for many psychologists. And I know for me that's been the case that many life experiences, but especially in my, early adult years, going to university and living in the UK, I think a lot of experiences opened up things about my identity that I hadn't realized before. Those are typical years for identity formation, but at the same time, I think being an Arab or a Muslim in the US and the UK was really informative for me. And especially that I was living in the US in a kind of post 9/11 time where, as we know, Islamophobia is a big issue around the world. And I think that we are only now starting to get to grips with the depth and the intensity of this issue globally. So I would say also that just the past year since the start of the genocide in Palestine, I guess being at the forefront of the news and all of that since that past year has really been an awakening journey for me in my psychological work and in my own personal journey. I think that for many people in this region and beyond this region, there's been a sense of the veil dropping and really opening our eyes to the reality of dynamics that maybe we could have been less conscious about, or we could have lied to ourselves about on some level about human rights and who's going to protect whom in these moments of crisis and need. So I think for me, the experience of having such deep grief and anger and all these this mixed bag of emotions has been really informative for me, and also supported me alongside my clients' journeys as they start to discover these layers of their identity and what it really feels like to be living in this world.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. It is so relevant, and you touched upon something so important, that the world is changing. The world has changed. I think many of us have changed as well. And I think the important thing to recognize is that, I almost feel like there's been like this crack in our internal worldview, and this illusion has been broken. And what I mean by that is that the influence that the Western world has like had on the rest of the world, and the prominence of that, I think, in order to understand it, it's important to like go back to the history, right? Yeah. All of these things that you were mentioning about your like identity, the Islamophobia, the inferiority that one feels when, for example, to the Western culture and to the West. So to go back to that, let's go back to the history, and that is colonization, right? And we hear this word being thrown around a lot, and I mean that in a good way, because a lot of us are becoming more aware of what it is and what it means. So as always, I like to start with definition. So perhaps you can define what exactly is colonization and what does it mean to be colonized?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And within that, I'll touch on what are we working towards when we decolonize.
Sure.
So as you said, colonization on one level, we know it as the removal of land, basically the systematic removal of land or people from their land.
Yeah.
The reality is that it's a systematic and methodical movement of culture, of trust, of language, of history, of freedom, of spirit, and it really works towards individualism is a main tenet of it. Separation from one another, separation from our land.
Yeah.
And I think that as humans also, one of the main consequences has been about the compartmentalization of mind versus body versus spirit. So it really feels like things are about breaking up and separating from their true natural way. Now, when we talk about decolonization, we're talking on one level about a return to a physical home. But most of the world at this moment is not experiencing necessarily that type of colonization actively. We see it happening in Palestine, where people are being moved from their land and different parts of the world. But many of us who are also trying to decolonize, we can say that we're working with other layers as well as that. So we're thinking also about a return to an emotional home, a spiritual home, a cultural home, or an ancestral home. And psychologically, we like to think about how are we reintegrating layers of our identity that were once separated or rejected by us and rejected by other people.
Yeah.
So we unconsciously have been performing potentially in certain ways based on colonial expectations. And decolonizing psychologically is about reintegrating the identity, all layers.
That's beautiful. Would you mind giving us an example of what a decolonization would look like from like an emotional or psychological standpoint?
Yeah, sure. So I guess just as an example, I can think of someone who was talking to me about realizing that she for a long time was wearing masks about who she should be and what she should be like. She was reflecting, she's now in her mid-30s, but she was reflecting about being a high school student in the UK. She was there for boarding school, and she realized that she had spent so much of her time wearing a mask and she wore it as a badge of honor of, I'm the good type of Arab, and I know how to present myself, and I know how to mix.
I'm westernized.
I'm westernized, and I'm not violent, and I'm educated. And oftentimes we wear these, and we present certain behaviors in groups because we believe that that's the correct way to be. And for her, there was a lot of grief in this realization that, how much time she has lost and how much connection with her identity she had lost just by keeping on this performance to some degree. So for my work with her has really been about how does she really come back to what feels right for her and to not be so preoccupied with what the expectations of others are, and also to to start asking herself. Decolonization is all about curiosity rather than imposing more systems in place, right? So she starts asking herself, what do I really care about? What feels meaningful for me? So that's a big part of the process, is coming back to who you truly are, kind of beneath the surface.
Yeah. And not being shy, like not shying away from that as well, right?
Exactly.
Because as you said, all that influences tends to take us away from wanting to express ourselves, who we are, like culturally, ancestrally, and all that as well. I would love to talk about the long-term psychological effects of colonization. I was thinking about this a lot and doing the research, and essentially I was like, well, what are the long-term effects? And once I started to read, I was like, well, the list is endless, from systemic oppression to, cultural erasure, to loss of identity, to intergenerational trauma. I mean, the list, do I need to say more? The list was extensive. So I was like, okay, holy shit, there's a lot of long-term psychological impact. So I wanted to get into that a little bit with you as a psychologist, but also as an Arab. How do you think, or what do you think are the long-term psychological effects of colonization?
So I can speak, as you said, the list is endless. There's no limits to the impact, because each person will have had a different experience of it. But as you say, it's kind of helpful to have ideas, because the more we know them, the signs and symptoms, the more you're like, oh, that's kind of happening for me. And I didn't realize that was part of that, related to that systemic oppression. So one of the things I see so much, especially here in Dubai, because I think we're a society that's very highly focused on work and productivity, is that with colonialism was this rise in capitalism that happened at the same time. And capitalism has always really been about overvaluing productivity and commodifying people's worth to their productivity. So what I find very often with people is that they base all of their self-worth on how productive they are and how much they're contributing. And, there's sometimes systems in place that can reinforce that. And it becomes very difficult for a person to have this intrinsic sense of self-worth. And by that dynamic going on, it often leads to things like burnout, working too hard, not giving yourself permission to slow down, in moments where you need to grieve or where you need support, not seeking out support, because we don't have that internalized sense of, I am worthy as a human being. It becomes all about my productivity and what I'm contributing from myself.
And it's almost like we're associating our sense of worth with the amount of like output or productivity that we have, right?
Yeah.
And that, as you said, is dangerous, because then that becomes the sole focus of like who we are.
Yeah.
Very
And
interesting.
it's you can understand why systems of oppression would work well when people are just working hard and not slowing down, and why that might be a motivation. What people don't realize is that we internalize this somehow unconsciously. So we can get into this pattern of oppressing ourselves, pushing ourselves down, and particularly some communities over others, of course, where there has been more oppression. So that's definitely been something big. The other one I notice quite a lot is this hyper-focus on individualism, which is really this kind of agenda around self-care and
Don't even get me started.
I think everyone kind of, we start hearing these words and we're just like, this has gone in the wrong direction. So many people are now, and I'm really glad, because we're practicing with consciousness rather than just practicing, unconsciously, where we just follow trends. And, we do, for example, yoga is meant to be very community oriented and collectivist and awakening. It's not meant to just be a workout or focusing on what outfits you're wearing. And, I feel passionate about yoga, so this is why I'm bringing this up. But I think it's really important, because Western psychology has fallen to some degree into this category of, my well-being is based on how good I feel and how productive I am, rather than thinking about well-being as how connected am I to my community?
Sure.
Like
Collectively.
collectively, what are we doing as a whole? So this is another area of long-term impact of colonization, which I see quite a lot. What we talked about earlier with this kind of West is best mindset, I think really happens a lot unconsciously. And, ironically, I think sometimes you get comments from people being like, for example, where did you study? As a psychologist, you often get this question.
Oh my gosh, absolutely.
Just to question, is your degree valuable enough?
Yeah.
And
how educated are you?
How
right?
educated, but how much from the West have you gotten? Because that's what's more valued. But ironically, it comes a lot from Arabs, and I understand it, so I don't pass judgment of it.
It's the same in my country, you know. Yeah. Yes. How good is your English? That's such a big one.
Yeah.
We like, it's called like testimonial injustice, but like the same person could be saying the same thing, but like one person that has like an accent, let's say, would tend to be taken less seriously than someone, let's say, who has an English or an American or accent, So this is also, derived from colonialism.
Yeah, of course. And it makes a lot of sense why people might be in that mindset, that they're struggling to let go of it. Like I've been visiting schools recently for my daughter, and it's been really lovely, but I notice how much people emphasize UK trained teachers or US trained teachers, and it's a fact of life. And I know the other fact of life is that in order for her to get to maybe certain levels of success, is you kind of have to be part of the system. Some people are going a long way and it's amazing. They're changing the education system. And for some people, it just is the most practical thing to go into it, but help with developing a kind of critical mindset so that we can expand beyond it to some degree. So that's not to say there's anything wrong with the UK curriculum or the US curriculum. It's just about being able to critique, like, where's all this emphasis coming from?
Absolutely.
And noticing when we're doing it unconsciously. And then I guess, as you said about intergenerational trauma, that's a really big one. I think Western psychology has had this tendency towards focusing on the individual's psyche and, what's their inner world like, and sometimes decontextualizes that maybe their parents have been through severe oppression and trauma, or their grandparents or their great-grandparents. And I always encourage my clients to be asking questions, what did I learn from my parents? What did my parents absorb in the environment that they were in? So for many of us, it might have been our parents or great-grandparents or grandparents who experienced colonialism firsthand. And then we can ask ourselves, what did they learn about themselves, about the world, about their safety, about their emotions through colonialism? And then what did I learn kind of passively through that that I need to start unlearning? So there's a lot that happens intergenerationally.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I'm so glad you mentioned about like individualism versus collectivism, because I think this is very prominent in the mental health space in general. I mean, you've been in the mental health space for so long now, so I'm sure you see how we treat mental health problems as an individual problem, at least in the West. And you studied in the US and UK, so I'm sure you saw those patterns, or maybe you did not. I'm curious to know if you did. But I feel, at least from my own studies, that there's this focus on the individual. So if you have a disorder, the problem is in you rather than the problem is in the society or a consequence of, whatever it may be, oppression, racism, or, moving to a new country where you don't speak the language, or, migration. So I think sometimes we're missing the overall picture when we're medicalizing people's problems as individual mental health issues, when we should be looking at it more, systemically, I would say, and societally rooted.
Exactly. Yeah, that's it. I think there is a level of awakening that's happening around that, but the majority of models that people are learning as psychologists are these Western-based models. courses are starting to integrate more indigenous models and lecturers from different backgrounds. But the progress is very slow. And I think a lot of psychologists have to do their own work around doing extra training and understanding better. Because, as you said, when our theory about the sense of self is totally focused on the self and the maybe parent-child relationship, for example, but they're not considering contexts that are different from the majority of people in lecture halls. So my experience as a Bahraini student at the age of 18 that moved to a university in Boston, a very small, American university, was very different. What was my context, my contextual upbringing? They don't really bring that up in most lectures, which is when you think about it, it's really interesting because you think, some people might be from different countries, having had experienced totally different things from me as well.
Sure.
So it's sometimes we feel like, okay, here's a model, but it's not capturing me. I'm not captured somehow within this. And how can we expand it and, understand better?
Right. Very well said. Yeah. Summer, we can't talk about colonization and not talk about Palestine. And I think this is a very heavy topic on a lot of us, but I think it's a very important topic. And I mean, this has been going on for 75 years, but for the past year, I would say, we've been seeing, the oppression that's been happening on our phones, right? We've been seeing the genocide going on, ongoing, what's happening in Palestine on our phones. And obviously, any normal human cannot comprehend the level of injustices that is going on. But there seems to be a divide, and it's quite worrying because, and I'm very curious about this from a psychological standpoint, because I feel that you might know a person and they're subjectively or objectively good, and yet they're in complete denial about, the ongoing genocide in Palestine, or they don't speak up or speak out about what's happening, or even in, Sudan and Lebanon now as well, so they're completely either in denial or they might not care about the oppression that's happening. So, what my brain always asks me is that how is it possible that, the same person could care about, I don't know, a stray dog or someone being in pain, but then completely deny of what's going on, an ongoing genocide.
I mean, it's such a good question, and it's so mind-boggling, I think, to many of us who care so deeply and who are trying to be, at least on some level, I think we can all try and do more all the time, but on some level we're trying to be proactive. And so I think the reality is there's things that we can guess about why that's the case, and I think part of it is by design. I think some systems are specifically designed to, for example, dehumanize populations, to politicize or politicize their own trauma, other things like that, where certain systems for power have been created in order to stop people from caring or engaging with it. And part of it is partly human condition, unfortunately, that there's a part of the human condition that gets sensitized or desensitized to things and that can be dehumanized. And it makes it very difficult to interact with people like that. So I do think that a part of this is very heavy kind of brainwashing and conditioning towards not caring about certain populations, as with all types of oppression, just believing on some level unconsciously that certain people deserve human rights more than others.
Wild.
And it's really painful to witness, as you said, people who have all these layers of depth and care somehow is, both in oppression, both the oppressed and the oppressor experience this dehumanization in a way, because the oppressor has to somehow disconnect from their own humanity in order to not see the other as human.
Yeah.
So I think that's a part of what's going on, generations of conditioning. And as I said, unfortunately, I think it's very hard to see someone not do something, and then it leaves us, other people who are witnessing this, left with the question of what do I do? Like, how do I activate someone? How do I, wake someone up?
And how would you go about that?
So that's also a very hard question, because I think the frustration and all the feelings, I'm always someone who says the feelings are welcome, welcome your feelings and look after yourself through them and allow them to be there and allow them to motivate you. And simultaneously, we have to be very careful about shaming other people, because I think often that's not effective in getting people to mobilize. Rather than shaming, often an open invitation can be really helpful to people, writing to them by email, messaging them as an open invitation, like, I've noticed this, I'm curious about it. That is probably the most effective way to communicate, but that's not to dismiss. I'm not saying that you shouldn't have rage or you shouldn't be angry, because everyone, the emotions are so central in resistance, right? So I think part of it is inviting people to try and do more in an open way. And for us, if you are experiencing those feelings of frustration and hurt by other people, it's sometimes about questioning whether part of it is truly them and part of it is your own projection of them.
Sure.
Because we project a lot of our rage that we feel towards systems of oppression and, the violence that maybe even our ancestors experienced. We can project it all onto certain characters and certain people. So it's also about becoming very aware of these projections.
That's interesting.
And managing some of the feelings that way. And like I said, I want to reiterate that there's nothing wrong with the anger, because anger is very powerful. It's a very powerful tool for resistance. Yeah. But it's like, what do we do with that anger? How do we mobilize it and channel it? Exactly.
Right.
And shame doesn't work. Shaming people does not work.
Right.
Unfortunately.
I mean, that's the truth.
Yeah.
And obviously, like, if you want people to see the reality of it by coming like as an attacking mode, so as in shaming them, we'll probably not, we'll make their defenses probably go up even more, whatever that may be.
Exactly, yeah.
Right. I wanted to ask you, Summer, and then as I was thinking of this question, it made me feel weird to ask it. So many of us have like a sense of guilt, helplessness, hopelessness with everything that's going on. And I was going to ask you, how does one and how did you yourself navigate that? But it almost feels quite horrible to ask it, because there's actual people living in this, so it feels almost selfish to say, how do I deal, how do I deal with this when there are real people, real Palestinians suffering today, and they can't like switch off from it, So
I think it's a really important question, to be honest. If anything, because I do think emotions themselves can really mobilize us in a way that's very supportive or very supportive towards the Palestinian cause. And sometimes emotions, if we deal with them in a certain way, it can block us from supporting the cause, if that makes sense. We can get blocked in certain ways. So especially, this is something I hear a lot about guilt. And I think, the people who care the most can get stuck at guilt. And it's really hard, because then we get almost burnt out from just experiencing so much guilt. And we don't need to be ashamed about experiencing the guilt. We're rather talking about, how do I kind of allow the guilt to be there and still use my energy towards something, towards this cause. So what I do want to say about guilt is the guilt will turn up. The guilt will be there about, why am I not doing more? What should I be doing? All the times I should have done more, all the things I should have known and I didn't know. There's going to be a lot of guilt that comes up. Now, guilt can be informative, because it can tell us, like, look, this is something you care about, right?
Yeah.
That's really informative and that's helpful. I think where guilt becomes less effective is where we get caught in it, and it becomes a neurotic, obsessive thinking, where it's like, I'll only be happy with myself if I've done X.
Right.
I'll only be happy if, I'll be satisfied with myself if this much has happened when I put this on Instagram or when I create this fundraiser.
Sure.
And
then it becomes obsessive and
yeah.
unhealthy way of
and it becomes
helping.
self-focused rather
Sure.
than externally focused.
Sure.
So I think to some degree we need to, we can see guilt as a self-attack. And the more we're attacking ourselves, the more internally we're focused, right?
Yeah.
We're just trying to resolve that inner battle. Whereas if we can resolve some of that and just have a better language with ourselves, better dialogue with ourselves of, okay, I'm trying my best. I'm going to try better next time. I'm going to keep trying better in a compassionate way. Then we can become much more externally focused. And we can say, oh, that's my goal. This is what it's all about. I'm not so obsessed with myself and my wrongdoings or right doings. I'm actually, your eyes open. It's like the windshields go from here to it just opens up. You're like, oh, this is what I care about. Now I can put all my effort into this and I can be external focused. And I've resolved some of that internal conflict that's been a barrier for me.
Wow. Thank you for that. That's so beautiful. And I think that makes so much sense because, as you said, the more you focus on me, and that internal, you're actually taking away from how you can be maybe productive or helpful, truly, truly helpful for that cause. Another thing, I mean, this again ties with the guilt, but it's that and I feel horrible to say this, but it's the reality of it. Sometimes I feel I have to switch it off almost, so I can function on a day-to-day basis and almost pretend that it doesn't happen. It feels so horrible to say this. If we're always thinking about it, it's so easy to just be.
I think on some level we need to stay connected to it. As you say, we need to have the awareness around it. We need to be feeling with people. Because of the way society is created, we have other things that we need to get to and we know our capacities. So there might be certain times or certain days of the week where you're I won't be able to check as much today. I think it can be worse sometimes to keep checking but then get desensitized to it or to get burnt out by it because I'm just checking for the sake of checking so I don't feel bad. Yeah. And then we become almost desensitized to it and it becomes part of social media, which it's not. It is not social media, right? Where actually the true process of feeling this requires time. It requires that when you've seen someone lose their life or lose their child or lose their limbs, or when you see that pain, to honor it, to honor the grief, to honor that person, it requires space and time and to allow it to move you in order to move towards action. As opposed to sometimes us getting into what is social media, which is this dopamine seeking, and it's really unhealthy and messed up in a way that people can almost get addicted to checking. And then it becomes desensitizing. I think there's something really valuable about knowing yourself, being connected to it in whichever way is right for you, remaining connected to the feelings that are evoked, the grief, allow it to move you, pray for the people who you're witnessing, and that gives you space to evolve it into action, rather than getting caught in the algorithm of social media.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I think you've made such good points because, as you said, this isn't social media. This is reality. These are actual people, Yeah. And you're right. There are times when you see people posting things we're forgetting, you see that, some people are saying don't stop talking about Palestine, don't stop talking about the cause, because as you said, people become desensitized to it, I'd love to talk about the identity of colonized people. And I think this is a really important topic as well, because when we think of colonizers and what they do, a colonizer can impose their, customs, their language, their behavior, and so much more onto the colonized population, right? And I think what ends up happening is that the colonized population starts to lose not only their sense of identity, but, loss with their culture, loss with their ancestral traditions, and also loss, I would say, of sense of like identity almost as well, you know? So I'd love to ask you if you can talk to us about cultural displacement and also the impact of it, not only on our mental health individually and collectively, but also on our identity and sense of agency as well.
Okay. Yeah, for sure. I think it's such an important point that, our culture often is, especially in this region and collectivist societies, our culture really shapes a big sense of who we are. And as you said, a kind of necessity within within colonization has been about removal and disconnection from language and culture. So you see that in what they're discovering a lot of now, I guess they're talking about is the residential schools in Canada where American Indians at the time, or Indigenous people, were unable to speak their own languages. They had to cut their hair. They had to disconnect from all of their cultural norms. The same in India, where all the curriculums were switched to English, for example. And we see that here, and I can really connect with it myself because I'm someone whose English is much stronger than my Arabic. And it's always been natural to me because of the school I went to. And my parents did speak English pretty well because of their teenage years. So then it just became easier to speak it at home. And I'm looking back and grieving for example, the connections I missed out on with my grandmothers, with my grandfathers, the things I could have learned from them if only I was more comfortable speaking Arabic, and really connecting with them. My grandmother, she passed away in February, Allah yarhamha, and she knew so much about our land, about the trees, about the plants and what the benefits are. And she learned that so much wisdom of the land that you don't really pick up in books, because part of actually colonization has been erasure of your history. And, at school we didn't learn our history as a country, or, those sorts of things where there is a real sense of grief when you can really tap into it. Of what's been lost, truly, because we often just go about our day and we forget those things. And now with that consciousness, there's a lot of effort, I think, at least for myself, and I see many people, which is really lovely. I see a lot of people doing this, where they're trying to reconnect with the culture and with the language for their kids and for the future generations, because these events in Palestine are not trivial in the sense that people realized, wow, an entire population could be erased, and someone might not be there to save you or to save your people or to save your land. We might have believed that human rights, or, the structures in place would save people, and we're seeing now for a year or so that nothing's really changing. And so there's an existential sort of crisis with this cultural element, and I sense a community level awakening to the value of that. So I think that those elements of identity, what we also see is siloing of parts of ourselves, the compartmentalization. So there's parts that I'll only show to my Bahraini friends, and there's parts that I'll only show to my, certain
I think
people.
they call it code switching.
Code
is that
switching,
what it is?
Yeah, I think so. That's where you read the environment and you think, okay, I'm going to be on this type of behavior. And that's really hard psychologically, because again, it's very unconscious, but you can bring it to your consciousness. But then we lose that sense of integration of all parts of myself are accepted.
Sure.
And then we repress parts of ourselves, and we have these shadow parts that emerge. So psychologically around identity, I would say this compartmentalization, code switching is really common to happen.
Wow, that's so interesting. I was actually speaking to this professor from King's College London on my podcast recently, and the topic of conversation was on race, culture, and mental health. And he was saying the same thing, and we were talking about the same thing. So I was also, raised here in Dubai, but I am grieving the fact that I can't speak Arabic, and I am Muslim as well. And now I realize that because the UAE is so like westernized, I would say, and like in schools, like English is the most like prominent language or the main language in school. Arabic wasn't like taken seriously, So you're absolutely right. Like I grew up in a country where its mother tongue is Arabic, and yet I cannot speak the language, and it brings me so much like pain now. I'm like, damn it, if only I knew. And this is all a part of it, This is really all a part of that idea. Yeah.
But what I do want to say on that, which is really, I believe this spiritually on some degree, that the more we can connect with the grief, the more awakened we feel to what's actually happened. Because grief really crystallizes like actually what's important to me. So we grieve that, and it's not a bad thing to grieve it. It's good because then it really brings into highlight, this is what's important to me. This is what matters. This is what I'm going to focus on for myself, and maybe I'll bring to my community. And I see so many amazing people doing this now, entrepreneurs who are really focusing on just reintegrating the culture in their own special ways, depending on what their talents are.
Absolutely. You're so right. Even friends that I've known from when I was very young in school. I mean, I grew up in Dubai. We're like a melting pot of like different cultures. Like I see now a lot of my friends who are like half African, like would almost like suppress that side of them. Whereas like now I see they're much more comfortable like expressing like who they are from like, from their like heritage. Yeah. And I think, I mean, we owe a lot to Palestine, and just to that cultural or collective shift that you were talking about, But and when you think about it now, like you say, when you're aware of it, it's crazy to you to think that like we can't be ourselves, like we can't identify with our culture, we can't identify with our language or things like that. Like it's wild, but the reality is that it's true, Like you said, the more westernized you are, and again, nothing wrong with the West. Everyone's like, oh my God. But the more westernized you are, like the more, I don't know, intellectual you look, or the more civilized, I would say, people think you are, and it's very wrong.
And it actually is really hard for, I think, people from the West as well, to a different degree and a different type of way, because they receive a lot of projections from other people. They receive like, oh, you should be better than us, you should be, or maybe their sense of imitation, or sometimes they receive a lot of rejection from people, which again can be our own stuff, our own projection. So in order to evolve past oppression, we kind of have to drop our projections onto people. I think that's really important to remember, because there's a book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And
I hate that word too.
I always pronounce it wrong. But he talks about the journey to liberation. And often, almost always, going from oppressed, you then oppress other people in the process. And I don't say that this is necessarily happening with the West, and it happens with other people that you start oppressing in the process. But we need to transcend past that into true liberation, which breaks down this dynamic of rejecting one, accepting one. It's actually, connecting with true humanity, which I think is really important to say.
Yeah, thank you so much for saying that as well. I definitely agree with you. And this is in no way trying to like bash people from other cultures, because as you said, the whole point is to make everyone feel safe, secure, like be who they want to be, whether that's culturally, individually, etc. So, Summer, I think one thing I wanted to speak to you as well about is like the resistance and the resilience, I would say, of the Palestinian population and of Arabs in general. On the one hand, I think we need to celebrate resilience. But on the other hand, I am a little bit conflicted, because I feel like they were almost imposed, like this oppression was so imposed on the Palestinian people that they almost had no choice but to be resilient.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So on the one hand, I want to celebrate it, but I also don't want to undermine, or I want to recognize like the importance or the consequence of like why they had to be so resilient because of the injustices that were imposed onto them. But saying this, do you think sharing stories of resilience and resistance is important? And if so, why?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and it's helpful to make that distinction and
Yes.
set that context to say a human shouldn't have to be, we shouldn't put them in a circumstance like that to need to be so resilient. But I think, as you said, it's been so inspirational to see how Palestinians are responding. Firstly, in Gaza, watching people with how they, can keep their kids entertained, how they have these little kids clubs, and the chefs who are making meals, and the stories of the people who are in farming who are persisting. And it's just, I'm having goosebumps speaking about it because it's so powerful. And, again, something that we often are guilty of as psychologists is talking about the trauma and the trauma and the trauma and the trauma. But really, we're forgetting the intergenerational resilience, the strength of the people who have survived what they have survived and the oppression. And that, I think, can be firstly very inspirational to other people. Like you said, it makes us really, in a way, it puts everything into perspective. And you're like, what am I complaining about? It's really good to ask ourselves that question, which is without, undermining ourselves or dismissing ourselves. But there's really much bigger things happening in the world, and I'm going to focus my energy on that stuff and not get bogged down in the details of my life, of the little day-to-day issues
that we always get bogged into.
Yes, exactly. And simultaneously, they have awakened us. Like you said, we owe so much to Palestinians for awakening all of these levels and these realizations within us about what matters in the world, what we want to focus on, how do we truly liberate from injustice. Yeah, I know. Same here. So I guess, so your question was, should we celebrate? Should we talk about them? And what's the importance of them?
Yeah. Like the stories of resilience. And I think what you said answered it for me, because when you see the chef, or the kids playing, you are amazed at how strong they are.
Yeah.
And how they've persevered.
Yeah.
This all.
And I would hope for many of us, it has for me, it's given me a lot more strength to persevere and to say, I can face challenges and I'm going to overcome this. And the anxieties I have about little things are really not that important. And look how amazing humans can be. And I'm inspired to be better because of them. So I think that the stories of resistance, because what we can be guilty of and what has been a big part of dehumanizing the Middle East and Orientalism and Africa as well has been about framing them as victims only, and that you lose the sense of the life, the Palestinian life and the culture and all the things that we want to celebrate and revive. So I think the stories of resistance are actually, I wish more of social media could be that, because it gives people energy also to act. So rather than, sometimes getting burnt out and creating, maybe reinforcing a certain image. And I think many Palestinians have spoken about it, like, don't feel sorry for me, be here to celebrate me, and I am empowered and I have a voice, and help me raise my voice. Share my story, rather
don't silence our voices.
Exactly.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Summer, as we're coming close to the end of this episode, there's, one or two more questions that I would have liked to ask you. The first one is, what do you think is the importance of educating ourselves about colonial, racist, and Anglocentric idealisms? And why should people care? Why is it important that we do educate ourselves about this?
Yeah, I think it's really important. Firstly, we're constantly in interaction with the world around us. So even in our small interactions, even in how we talk to ourselves, even in how we talk to our friends, we're influenced by the context. And part of the context is these dynamics that are often not spoken about at all. And they're because of that, unconscious. And when something is unconscious, then it often dictates how we feel without us being able to understand it, be aware, and maybe potentially overcome it. So a big part of this increasing our awareness is recognizing that the personal is always political. We're always a microcosm of the external world. But if we ignore it, then unconscious dynamics play out between people, whether that's projections and rejection or idealizing and not focusing on our true values, focusing on what we've been told. Without doing that, we aren't able to develop a true sense of self and to be really clear on our values and be clear in our relationships. We are very easily influenced by the world around us when we're not conscious of, as you said, those idealisms, racism, things that are happening constantly at work and with our friends, with anyone that we come into contact with. We don't realize what we're doing and what unconscious bias we have, and we don't realize what unconscious biases are being projected onto us.
Yeah, that's so true. In the field of mental health, and I think this is like a really good way to think about how to move forward with this. But and we briefly touched upon this already, but therapeutic modalities like psychological interventions, the way that we currently look at therapy as a whole is derived, 90%, if not all, from the West, right? And even practices like mindfulness-based practices have been westernized, so a lot of the therapeutic tools that we give to people right now are very, Western-centric.
Yeah.
So now that we're, as you were talking about, there's such a shift in the way we understand psychology and the way that we should help people. What would a decolonized mental health or psychological practice look like?
Yeah. So my advice to a therapist partly would be, going on your own decolonizing journey. I think that's the most important thing, because you can sense, if you're a client, you can sense from your therapist if they're really getting what you're talking about. Because no matter what race a person is, they've been impacted by colonization, and there's a level of awakening that's required, no matter where you're from, no matter what race you are. And a client will very easily pick up on, like, can I go into this? Is it safe to go here? Will my therapist feel uncomfortable while I talk about this? So I really encourage all mental health professionals to go on their own journey around this. And the second thing I encourage is that they start really looking at their models, and rather than what has been practiced, normal practice has been extracting from indigenous cultures and giving them Western names. A lot of our models are actually, a lot of our models are really based on much older practices than, the early 19th century. It's actually, they go way
white
back.
Male.
Exactly. So for therapists themselves to be asking the questions, being curious, where did this come from? Should I expand my reading list? Start thinking about different authors, joining. So it's not, again, we're not rejecting one type of therapy and imposing a new type of therapy.
Sure.
It's about that curious lens and taking a step back and trying to be open and applicable to everyone rather than catering to a certain population. So some themes I would touch on are, as we talked about, moving from the individualist to the collectivist mindset, to starting to integrate how's this person interacting in their community rather than just their sense of self. And with emotions in particular, it's very interesting because mental health, Western psychology in particular, has had a reputation. I'm not saying everyone practices like this, but has had practices in the past that were very oppressive, that had to do with diagnosis, incarceration, institutionalization, and oppressing people, and sedating emotions, potentially emotions that were very healthy responses to oppression.
Yeah.
But it was all about, pushing those down and making people act in civilized, quote unquote, civilized ways. So as a therapist, it's really important to start shifting our mindset around how do we work with emotions, rather than I need to manage this person's emotions, or we need to reduce these emotions. Yeah. As I said, in my own personal experience, I realized emotions are so central to mobilization, to liberation, to actually being oriented about what's most important. And that's been, to some degree, removed from Western psychology. So I would really encourage therapists to consider ways in which we are unconsciously, and I say this again, therapists are very often very well-meaning, but unconsciously might be engaging in oppression by telling people to behave certain ways or to do certain things to reduce their emotions.
Right. That was beautiful. And it might also be about changing the questions that we're asking, right? Yeah. I was listening to this talk by this American psychologist, and I actually wrote it down. Her name is Thema Bryant. She's African-American, and she said that to decolonize psychology is also to recognize that justice is therapeutic, justice is healing. And I found that really beautiful. And she said it's not just about taking breaths or journaling, but really a real shift in social systems, and I think that really captured everything that you were saying very beautifully as well.
Completely, yeah. That's such a beautiful way to frame it, because very often I think we have this idea, as you said, we need to not feel a certain way so that we can be productive towards our lives, towards the things that we should be doing. Whereas our emotions are so powerful in actually waking us up to what matters, to what we really want to do, to how we support the collective, how we move, how we, change as a whole population. We're going really numb, and it's very dangerous to be sedating. And like we said, you can use yoga and breath work as a sedating, individualistic approach, or you can use it the way it was meant to be used, which is more community level awakening, becoming conscious, and it's a form of resistance, I guess.
Absolutely. Well, Summer, I guess as a final question, do you have any resources, support groups or books even that you'd like to share with us? I know that you host your own circles, and you also do grief support groups at Lighthouse Arabia in Dubai. So maybe you can share a little bit about that.
Yeah, exactly. So at Lighthouse, we offer lots of different support groups, lots of different grief support groups. People can visit the website, lighthousearabia.com, just to get a sense of the breadth. We offer a lot of trauma support and crisis support. So we do talks, for example, about Palestine and understanding the trauma, whether you're currently in Palestine, and also understanding secondary trauma of what you're witnessing outside of Palestine. And then we do the same. We have some at the moment for Lebanon. We have support groups for Lebanon too. In terms of practices, I would say it's really important to constantly bringing things into our consciousness as a population. So whether we're talking about this subject with our friends, I really encourage that we keep this in our awareness. Talk to a therapist about it. Hopefully, finding a therapist you can really connect with and talk about these topics with, because that's, as we go on our own journeys, we realize the only thing I can change is myself. And the more I awaken and the more I act and move forward, the greater this is going to be for other people. So I think things like that can be particularly helpful. There's a couple of authors, and I guess they're kind of like trainers, psychologists themselves, who I follow on Instagram, and I did some of their reading and courses. So there's Dr. Jennifer Mullen, who does decolonizing therapy online. And then there's Dr. Rosales Meza, and she has a few courses as well on decolonization. If this is a journey you're interested in, I would say it's all about bringing things into your consciousness and trying out these extra courses about how do I work with my emotions and go on this journey. So Rosales Meza is her name.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Oh, Dr. Summer, thank you so much. This has honestly been so helpful, useful. Thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge with us. And I really hope everyone listening leaves feeling empowered and a little bit more educated. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Sierra. No, it's been such a important and soulful conversation, I feel, because I can feel how much we're both connected to the topic. And I love when, our professional life and what we truly care about can genuinely coexist. So thank you for suggesting it. And thank you for arranging it.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in and listening. If you did like this episode, then please do subscribe to our channel, Behind the Stigma, just recently on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere you listen, really. I'll be sharing Dr. Fakhro's from Lighthouse Arabia's details in this episode description, so if you're interested, please do check out her work further at www.lighthousearabia.com. If you're feeling extra kind today, then feel free to drop us a review, as your support always helps us grow. You can also follow us on Instagram, that's at Behind the Stigma Podcast, and email us on behindthestigmapodcast@gmail.com for any queries or to collaborate. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next episode.